Hey guys, Chris here from Work to Game, Gaming Kinda, and now Gaming Kinda TV over on Facebook as well. That means that if you are watching this, it is October 13th or later, so I can finally share everything we learned from the media tour, but I do have a couple of disclaimers. First of all, Yoshi P opened his statement to us by saying a thank you to the medical staff over the last few years, and I would like to echo his thoughts. You've been asked of a lot in the fight over the last few years, and if 14 can help be a way to connect with friends or relax after a long day, then I am happy that I can share what we now know about Endwalker coming up very soon, and the devs hope that in some small way that can be a thank you and a place for you to enjoy and appreciate all that you do. Second, a disclaimer about the content itself. We were given brief access to a development build of Endwalker. Any footage I used from this time is development footage and will be labeled as such. Any of this is subject to change, any tooltips, any potencies, anything I show as they put the finishing touches on Endwalker may be subject to adjustments. Now, when I look at the things that affect all of the tanks, during the Job Action Live Letter, a statement was made that defensives used at optimal times by main tanks and even off tanks would benefit the tank. I didn't see this directly in the content that we were allowed to try at the media tour, but it could possibly refer to a change in how mitigation is used in encounters by making mitigation windows more meaningful or just making things hit harder. We didn't get a chance to do a lot of level 90 content, and so we'll have to see what that means. This statement still rings around in my head the way it was stated. Do jobs, just the way their changes in mitigation work? We've seen changes to things in the past, and I hadn't heard a statement quite like this for past expansions. So either I'm misremembering the way they've always presented these changes in the past, or I'm just not understanding quite yet what this means in how this is drastically different than any other time we've added or changed defensives moving into an expansion. The second statement was that ranged abilities no longer break combos for tanks or melee jobs. This is massive. Having tried every single job during the media tour, I can tell you that if I broke a combo, I now knew for a fact it was my fault. This gives me the ability to aim to improve at a pace that is entirely my own, and without the added layer of wondering, did the encounter make me mess up? Was there something weird about an ability that was called for breaking a combo? Trying to keep my uptime up with these ranged combos as I move out, I now get to make my own choices on what skills I prioritize within certain burst windows, and everything I do as far as completing combos, whether or not I am using a ranged attack, uptime is something I can now maintain while also trying to complete combos, which is something this expansion seems to be heavily leaning into across a number of jobs. This is a factor that has bugged me throughout Shadowbringers as I've aimed to improve as a player, and I think this is a wonderful change moving forward. Next, there was a statement that the parity between physical and magical attributes was different, and it was a carryover from the A Realm Reborn development, and that has now been fixed and will mean that physical abilities potencies would need to be lowered if the ability was to be doing the same damage relative to Shadowbringers. So behind the scenes coefficients, these things that we weren't really seeing outright represented in the UI cleanly and openly like potency is in a tooltip, will make it easier moving forward. But keep in mind that as we see potency adjustments, this is different than the stat squish, as we see potency adjustments, an increase in its strength might mean that the potency stays the same or goes up, and a decrease in an ability's strength, something for it to be nerfed, would need to be lowered even beyond what this is calling for. So as we compare potencies, when we talk about the fact that layered on top of this we have an attribute stat squish, everything's going to work just a little bit differently moving forward. The biggest thing that I can say we can take away from everything we can see right now, besides nerf and buff, is how do abilities compare to each other? Are there abilities that went up while other abilities went down within the same class? And does this help us understand where the importance of a combo action matters versus does the ability get as penalized when it's not used as a combo action? And that'll give us more of their mindset moving forward. And then, of course, as we see, theory crafters get into actual rotations, that will help us understand what this means as far as the way we play. And all of that will be useful when we get into the context of the game itself this November. Now, the stat squish is something independent of this, so any damage, any flyover text you see in any videos anywhere, that is, of course, going on. So remember that that's just going to feel different. I actually didn't feel any. I don't really feel the stat squish is something that felt any different than what I would say at media tour footage going into Shadowbringers, which was not filled with a stat squish. The potencies that are all shown are still subject to potential adjustments, so we are looking at the overall mentalities of what we learned, knowing that there might be still a few moving parts as they get down to the wire with what they can still change. I don't remember them stating exactly when the build date of our media tour build is from, but obviously from when that build was finalized to prep it for us to the build that releases on November 19th for early access to Endwalker, that will be a window that they could still change things. And lastly, looking at all of the tanks, let's look at role actions. When looking at the 4 tanks, while many abilities such as tank stance, ranged actions, gap closers, and even to some degree things like invulns can be similar, these 7 actions are literally shared. They're identical in every single way across the role and have not changed at all moving into Endwalker. Rampart, still a defensive. It's a flat 20% mitigation for 20 seconds. I felt a little softer in the one dungeon they let us try, but that could be that I was playing on a character without my proper keybind, so I was a little bit off. It could be that our healer, who was trying and adjusting incredibly well, was playing on Sage, so her total playtime adjusting to that class could not have been that much. Considering she is a healer that can clear E12, she still only had the job for a couple minutes, basically, before we went into the dungeon. A lack of familiarity with the encounters and anything that's going to work a little bit different in the way the encounters are designed. This is also only slightly insightful because the dungeon was not level 90 content, much less things like raids, trials, or even crazier savage, so it'll be hard to show if mitigation will feel worse or better this time around until we get into actual content. Low blow is still a 5-second stun. I would love to see this used more in encounters. That's not something we can know until we see the content of Endwalker. I just personally think that things like dungeons, which we did get to see one dungeon as well as some open world content, that's a sliver of what Endwalker could offer, and I would love to see this used more as we get into raids, alliance raids, definitely dungeons. Provoke, enmity, threat, hate. Shadowbringers turn this on its head with the shift to tank stance, and that does not appear to have been a big focus of what we are seeing moving into Endwalker. We're largely going to see that the same as Shadowbringers. It's the same 30-second cooldown, so if anything feels different as far as your ability to shift between main tank and off tank, especially as we talk about tank swaps where you're trying to rotate which tank is in charge, that's all going to likely feel different from the rotation side of things, which some jobs rotations this expansion changed a lot more than others. Interject, like low blow, I honestly just hope it gets used more. I think interrupts are not nearly used as often in this game as I would like them to be. I think they're something that adds an unpredictable additional task you need to do in your rotation, especially in content like dungeons, which don't have a harder mode available. Casual beginner players would just get hit by it. No big deal. They just have to pull slower because they're getting hit by extra stuff. Players that are willing to optimize that a little bit have one additional thing that they can practice doing. Knowing that dungeons are also something that we regularly outgear, we regularly don't need the gear from, and we're running them for roulettes to get tomes, this would be something that I think would add a lot of variety to dungeons. Just stuns, interrupts, things like that would be more intriguing in my mind. I don't see anything here saying that interject is going to be used any differently than it is now. Now, reprisal has not been changed at all, but is honestly just a god-tier ability. So if this is your first time hearing of reprisal, please use it, starting now. It doesn't matter if it's still Shadowbringers, use it. Endwalker tanks will be able to pull faster. Our ranged abilities, my warrior ranged ability got further. Gap closers on everybody but warrior went up to match warrior's 20-yard range, as well as almost all of the other jobs are getting something to help with movement. So we could very easily see tanks moving into double or triple pulls restricted only by the walls that dungeons put up. And this, when you get a big AoE pull in, reduces all nearby enemies by 10%. So it's just a flat reduction in damage. And you pair that with arm's length. It hasn't changed as well, but it is also an incredible thing for AoE pulling. It is likely the most understood ability in this section for new tanks or players coming over from another game who are simply misreading the terminology. In raids, this is usually used for anti-knockback, so I think we have that pretty well in hand as a community. It, however, works very similar to reprisal in dungeons when you pull big. It adds slow to enemies. In 14, the ability to reduce somebody's speed from movement is called heavy. Heavy gets placed on you, heavy gets placed on a mob, whatever. Heavy is what adjusts the movement speed. But if you are looking at swing speed, this is what slow means. And so when you have a lot of guys swinging at you repeatedly, this slows down how often they swing, which is going to reduce the number of times you're getting hit per second in these big pulls. So that's arm's length is still an incredible thing to use in dungeons. It's just you're not using it typically for the anti-knockback. You'd be using it for this ability to slow down how often a bunch of little guys hit you. Lastly, Shirk. Didn't change. I've never really needed this ability outside of Savage or Extreme. So unless the tanks are having to swap back and forth who's main tank in a tank swap mechanic, it's not an ability that I see typically used very much. It doesn't seem it's changed. So until we can get Savage, we won't really know how it feels switching threat versus this expansion. Obviously, everybody's learned to manage to clear all the content just fine. And that's the role actions. So nothing crazy for how this is going to impact any one of the tanks, much less all of the tanks. But I don't worry for individual tank changes being something that's going to feel like you don't know how to play your tank. We don't yet know everything that's going to feel different from playing Shadowbringers at level 80 versus Endwalker at 90. But as a general rule, I think when we look at the tanks as a whole, I don't see anything here in the broad category of tanks that's going to drastically change the way you play. It's mostly going to be in the individual changes that change your rotation, where you feel that your identity shifts any at all per tank. So I went over the role actions there, and I'd like to talk about just generally how I'm feeling about tanks. Having gone over all 4 tanks, I think that, first of all, to just tier list them, because the internet loves tier lists. All of them improved from Endwalker versus Shadowbringers as an Endwalker version of a job versus its previous version of itself. Nothing feels like it got left too static in this category. Nothing feels like it got just ignored. Everything feels like it got something. The category as a whole feel like it got some things, which not all categories did. So I think tanks in general got more love than I was expecting them to. But I think Dark Knight is the one that comes out with the least changes. It feels the most similar to where it is, and the problem with that is that the other jobs feel so drastically different. Gunbreaker just feels like it evolved into its true form, that it's truly excited, it's truly just ready to put additional cartridges downrange, do additional damage. That big double cartridge ability feels amazing, and you know, Paladin is a job that, like, of the 4 was my least favorite to play, and I really enjoyed dropping swords down on whatever. That was awesome. So I think that it feels as distinctive a difference as it did when they first got a gap closer and stuff. So I think Paladins changed as much as they did from Stormblood to Shadowbringers, Shadowbringers to Endwalker. I think they just carried that amount of change forward. I think that Warrior is the big winner. Warrior for me is the one that I already loved Warrior, and I would have loved it even if it was in Dark Knight's shoes here, and it just was like, well, more of the same. But I think Warrior was the big winner here. I think a lot of the changes across the board, extending the gap closers to 20 yards, Warrior already had that, and Warrior moved theirs to be in charges. I think, you know, not breaking melee combos, that felt worse on Warrior because the job was so centered on Fell Cleave that if you weren't generating gauge at your maximum rate per minute, it sucked. I think moving the big burst windows to these charges instead of like a 10-second burst on inner release, I think Warrior is so contingent on Fell Cleave as part of its identity that losing a Fell Cleave felt worse than breaking it up over on Dark Knight. I think the charges feels good. On Paladin, on Dark Knight, they have other parts of their identity, so if you lose that part, it sucks. But on Warrior, it's like, well, then why am I playing this? So I do think that the other jobs, it's basically how much do they benefit from following Warrior's lead? How much do they benefit from letting Warrior take the charge and decide what tanks needed to change into? Lots of self-sustain all the way around across the entire category. Lots of emphasis on let's get more AoE. Let's get you closing your gap into the action. It feels like speed pulling dungeons is just what they want. Let's go. It feels fast, and I think Warrior is going to adjust to these changes really well because Warrior is also, in my opinion, the job of the set that ages the best when you pull it down into a fair bit of the synced dungeons and trials that show up in your roulettes. Not all synced ranges on warriors feel well, so if you're trying to take it back into like synced or minimum item level higher end content, warrior does not always come out on top because it has not always been on top, but it does tend to keep a fair bit of its responsibility if you're just grabbing some tomes. And I've always really appreciated that, as opposed to something like Gunbreaker, that while it feels incredibly powerful, so other people might like having a Gunbreaker down in a synced dungeon, like I don't like running synced my leveling roulette on a Gunbreaker. I'd rather get my tomes on a different job, even if I'm going to spend them on my Gunbreaker. So I think that for me, tanks is a category that really got me excited for the fact that everybody's going to want to play Sage, everybody's going to want to play Reaper. I figured we were going to be short on tanks, and I'm really happy with the tank changes. I did get a chance to sit down and talk with Ren, who is a very good tank, and I think is one of the people representing tanks for the kind of higher end community. I know there's a lot of high end personalities, and that community would have liked every single one of their personalities to get to go. You know, it is a relatively small percentage of the total population, and so the diversity of the group, they have everything from people who don't really play the game at all, to people who are new to the game, to people who are new to the game but know other MMOs, to people who are veterans in the game. I do think Ren is one of the people representing that, so I encourage you to go watch his coverage on any and all tanks he has to talk about, and I'll be airing him and I talking, because like he knows what he's talking about, and I'm a lot more just of a generalist, and so we had a great conversation on all 4 tanks, and I think, you know, each of the conversations actually hits on some big generalities of the tanks in addition to the tank itself, so try to stay for all 4 or 5 videos. I'm still editing these, but I think the warrior one may have to break into 2. It's very long. Maybe it doesn't, but it's 4 or 5 videos. And I think in general, the tanks is something that really came out ahead and got me really excited about Endwalker. I don't think they had to, so I kind of had my expectations set around that they wouldn't. I think they could have stayed largely the same. I don't think they were really in a position where they were like hurting for changes, as opposed to somebody like Summoner, like Monk, where they had said, hey, we're going to have to do something. And so I think for me, the fact that they did still get a change was really great. It makes it very exciting, because I will probably be exclusively tanking at least from 6.0 to 6.1 outside of leveling the other jobs. And I'm excited. I think all in all, you know, the fact that we share gear does have me asking some questions about materia. We're getting less materia slots overall because we're losing belts as a slot. And so materia is one of the areas where you can't just average out for those, because like there is supposed to be a materia usage on the server. So I do wonder how that's going to average out, because pentamelding caps the amount of pieces. So it's just 5 less materia. Is it less raid tokens? Is it less weeks to gear up all the tanks? Because they do just share one set of gear as opposed to something like Melee. So, you know, how does that work? So as a tank, like I have some other just more general expansion questions. I'm looking forward to, like, is there something updating with the tank mounts? Are they going to have to do something to encourage people to continue to tank, as we have a lot of people interested in going healers? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what we need to do as far as the changes surrounding tanks, the logistics of tanks, but the actual act of tanking itself looks like it's better than ever before. I would have loved to see something tackled with tank stance. I don't really like tank stance as a concept. I think that the warrior adjustment of, you know, I think moving all of the gap closers, moving all the ranged abilities, moving all the invulns to be more identical, it does allow them to design more consistent encounters that can be more of a test of a tank and not have to restrict each mechanic to the weakest of the tanks versus that mechanic. But it's the definition of homogenization. So I think they are very likely going to be very, very balanced, because if anything, they feel more homogenized than ever before. So the balance does mean that if one of the particular flavors of tank is the one you are most attracted to, go play that one. I don't see anything here that says that any of the tanks are going to be something that would draw concern. And I'm excited to see more warrior tanks in general. I'm excited to see more tanks have things they can do as off tanks. And I'm interested to see what the purpose of all this extra movement and extra mitigation and what the purpose of that is. Are healers going to be expected to do more damage? They've got these 1.5 second casts. Are they going to be just kind of trying to heal with off globals as much as possible and mostly be a green DPS moving forward? And if that's the case, are warriors going to be expected to take care of themselves when things aren't truly tank busting them or something like that? A little bit more often, especially in normal content. So, I have some questions with how the kit changed, what that means for the mechanics, but nothing can answer those questions except it being November, except us playing Endwalker. So I think it's an exciting time to be a tank, but mostly at this point, it's just November is still so far away. That's all it is. That's where I'm at.